Welcome to part 3 of lesson 5, Say's Law of Markets. J.B. Say, a French classical economist, is best known for Say's Law, introduced in his seminal A Treatise on Political Economy. The law argues that production itself is the foundation of economic activity and growth. At the heart of this principle is the idea that entrepreneurs act as a dynamic force in the economy, serving as catalysts for innovation and expansion. Say explained that production creates the means for consumption, meaning that the only way individuals can obtain the resources to buy goods is by producing and selling goods that others value. In other words, exchange is a two-way street. One must first create or supply something useful to others in order to earn money to purchase desired goods. This reasoning asserts that the act of producing goods and services generates sufficient income through wages, profit, rent, and interest to purchase those outputs. As a result, aggregate supply tends to equal aggregate demand in a free market economy, provided there are no artificial barriers such as extensive regulation or trade restrictions. By framing production as the primary driver of economic activity, Say directly countered mercantilist fears of general overproduction, gluts, or prolonged recessions caused by underconsumption. In Say's era, economists debated whether widespread overproduction or general gluts could occur in a market economy. Say rejected this idea, contending instead that shortages and surpluses, what he called wants and gluts, were only temporary if markets were allowed to operate without government interference. In Treatise on Political Economy, he explained a product is no sooner created than it, from that instant, affords a market for other products to the extent of its own value, meaning that the very act of producing goods generates the income necessary to purchase other goods. At this time, economists had not yet adopted equations and graphs to simplify analysis, so their reasoning relied on verbal logic and concrete illustrations. For example, where we might describe a shortage of 13 bushels of corn, Say would have described a scarcity or a want of 13 bushels. More than a century later, Keynes reduced Say's carefully qualified argument to the oversimplified slogan, supply creates its own demand, misrepresenting Say's position by ignoring the fact that Say acknowledged temporary imbalances and adjustment periods. This early debate laid the foundation for the latter use of mathematical models and graphical tools, which gave economists a more precise way to demonstrate how markets move toward equilibrium after disruptions. By producing or selling valuable goods, individuals or firms generate income in the form of wages, profits, rents, and interest, which enables them to purchase other goods. This underscores the reciprocal nature of exchange, where one must offer something of value to acquire resources for consumption, similar to a barter system where goods exchange for goods, with money serving as a medium. This interpretation stands in contrast to Keynes' popular oversimplification and mischaracterization of Say's law as supply creates its own demand, since Say's law does not guarantee automatic demand. Instead, Say's law suggests that production enables market participation, preventing general overproduction, gluts, in a free market without barriers like excessive regulation or tariffs. Say's law of markets emphasizes that production is the true foundation of economic activity because producing goods generates the income needed to purchase other goods. For example, a carpenter builds furniture and earns income to buy food or clothing. This cycle of production and exchange sustains economic activity, directly challenging mercantilist views that prioritize gold hoarding or protectionism. Say's law instead promotes free trade and production-driven growth, and it remains influential in both classical and neoclassical economics. It continues to be taught in macroeconomics courses and informs modern supply-side policy debates, such as post-2008 recovery strategies or efforts to control inflation through supply enhancements. Key implications include the idea that production enables consumption by creating purchasing power, that recessions stem from market distortions, such as poor policies, rather than from excessive production, and that exchange is reciprocal, with money serving only as a facilitator in goods for goods trade. The entrepreneur is central in Say's law of markets because they act as a driving force behind production, innovation, and growth. Say identified the entrepreneur as distinct fourth factor of production alongside land, labor, and capital. Entrepreneurs are risk-taking coordinators who identify opportunities, assemble resources, innovate, and redirect assets toward higher productivity use. Unlike passive capitalists in modern supply and demand models, entrepreneurs bear uncertainty while leveraging creativity to generate value. For example, an entrepreneur launching a tech startup combines capital, funding, labor, engineers, and innovation, new software, to meet consumer needs, thereby creating jobs and sustaining demand. This framework complements Say's law by showing how entrepreneurial supply fuels income, in turn, demand. It shifted economic focus away from labor-centered views, like Adam Smith's, toward the dynamic role of enterprise. Today, this insight is a cornerstone of entrepreneurship studies, embedded in theories such as Schumpeter's creative destruction and applied across startup ecosystems, venture capital, and global policy frameworks that promote innovation. It also remains integral to MBA curricula and to analyses of tech-driven growth. The key implication is clear. Entrepreneurs drive growth through innovation. Policy should support risk taking and resource coordination, and entrepreneurial supply enables demand. Historical policy applications. In Say's era, Europe was transitioning from mercantilism, characterized by heavy state control, protectionist tariffs, and colonial exploitation, toward classical liberalism and freer markets. Say's law of markets and his entrepreneurial model became central to classical economics, shaping the thinking of economists such as Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and John Stuart Mill. Even though these early thinkers had not yet formalized their ideas with equations or graphical tools, their analyses were expressed in words and logical reasoning rather than lines on a chart. Policymakers drew on these ideas to critique market distorting interventions and to encourage production, innovation, and entrepreneurship. In post revolutionary France, economic instability from wars, inflation, and disrupted trade presented real challenges. And as an advisor and professor, Say applied his law to advocate for free trade and oppose Napoleon's continental system, a blockade against Britain that hampered both production and consumption cycles. His entrepreneurial model also supported loosening guild restrictions, allowing skilled innovators to expand economic activity. Across the Channel in Britain, Say's principles influenced debates that led to the 1846 repeal of the Corn Laws, lowering grain tariffs to enhance trade, affordability, and the flow of resources in line with production-focused vision. Collectively, these ideas helped fuel the Industrial Revolution by emphasizing market-driven production and enterprise over mercantilist wealth hoarding, even amid recurring crises such as the Panic of 1819. Say's law in action, markets without government intervention. Picture J.B. Say observing a village market where wheat, potatoes, and tea are sold in varying quantities and at different prices. Say argued that producing goods automatically generates the income necessary to purchase other goods, a principle often oversimplified as supply creates its own demand. By tracking how these products move between buyers and sellers, he illustrated how shortages or surpluses are resolved through voluntary exchange rather than government price controls, subsidies, or other interventions. Table 1 transcribes Say's imagined observations before and after the market naturally adjusts to eliminate gluts, what we would call excess supply today, and wants, what we would call excess demand today. I've copied the table from the lesson to Excel. Use the initial red values in Table 1 to fill in the following answer boxes. Initially, the difference in the quantity of wheat supplied and the quantity of wheat demanded equals what? The quantity of supply of wheat minus the quantity of wheat demanded is 411. We have excess supply here. If quantity demanded equaled quantity supplied, then we would be at the equilibrium. But that's not the case. We have quantity supplied greater than quantity demanded. So we're in a situation that looks like this, where quantity supplied would be this quantity down here, and quantity demanded would be this quantity here. And the price that farmers are asking for exceeds the market clearing price, resulting in what we call excess supply of wheat, which Say would phrase as there is a glut of 411 bushels of wheat. The difference in the quantity of potatoes demanded and the quantity of potatoes supplied equaling what? Let's go back to Excel. I'll drag this down. In this situation, quantity demanded exceeds quantity supplied by 245. So now we have demand greater than supply. we're in a situation like this where the quantity demanded, which would be this quantity, exceeds the quantity supplied. In this situation, the price of potatoes is below the market clearing price, resulting in what we call excess demand for potatoes, which Say would phrase as there is a want of 245 potatoes. Initially, the difference between the quantity of tea supplied and the quantity of tea demanded, the supply equals the demand, so this would be zero. This suggests that the prices apothecaries are posting in their stalls at the village market equal the market clearing price, resulting in the tea market clearing, which Say would phrase as the tea market is justly balanced. Because a product is no sooner created than it, from that instant, affords a market for other products to the full extent of its own value, the very act of producing goods generates the income necessary to purchase other goods. In Say's law of markets, any shortage or surplus is temporary, which is reflected by the blue values in Table 1. Use this information to fill in the following answer boxes. These numbers in the blue are operating under the assumption that supply is a vertical line here, which makes sense because what does an entrepreneur do? They analyze the market and then predict what they might be able to sell at a future unknown price. Based on those expectations, they produce some output, they bring it to market, they present it to buyers, and at that moment they present it to buyers, it's a fixed quantity. So in JB Say's world, supply would be a vertical line at the quantity that the supplier brought to market. So initially, the quantity supplied of wheat is $12.89 and quantity demanded is $8.78. The price that farmers are charging is way above the market. So what happens is wheat producers lower their price from 10.1 to 8. And they do that to clear the glut. They have to lower their price to clear the glut. Now that seems pretty obvious in today's world of economics, but back then it wasn't so obvious. So that's why the price comes down from 10.1 to 8. And that's why the quantity demanded goes up to 12.89. It was only 8.78. Now it's 12.89 and it equals final quantity supplied. So after markets are allowed to adjust, the difference in the quantity of wheat supplied and the quantity of wheat demanded equaling 0 bushels suggests that the prices wheat farmers are posting in their stalls at the village market equal the market clearing price, resulting in the wheat market clearing. That's what we'd say today, which Say would phrase as the wheat market is justly balanced. Now, initially with potatoes, the quantity supplied was much smaller than the quantity demanded. So the quantity supplied was only 322 and the quantity demanded was 567. So this right here is at 322 and this right here is at 567. And the prices that farmers are charging is below the market price. Consumers want to buy a bunch of stuff at this price. Suppliers only brought a little bit. Consumers are going to bid this price up. So if the price is allowed to vary, consumers are going to bid it up as they would today. When consumers bid the price up to 22.6 from 21, the quantity demanded no longer exceeds quantity supplied because it now equals quantity supplied. After markets allowed to adjust, the difference in the quantity of potatoes supplied and the quantity of potatoes demanded equaling 0 potatoes suggests that the prices farmers are posting in their stalls at the village market equal the market clearing price, resulting in the potato market clearing, which Say would phrase as the potato market is justly balanced. Now, what happened in the tea market? Well, the quantity supplied was 459, the quantity demand was 459, and the price was 15.3. Nothing needed to happen here. The apothecaries were charging the market price, so no adjustment is needed here. So in this situation, initially 459 ounces of tea are being supplied and 459 ounces of tea are being demanded at a price of 15.3. There's no adjustment, so this is still 459 for quantity supplied and quantity demanded, and the price is still 15.3. So there's no adjustments here. So this is still 0. This is still equal. This is still the tea market clearing. And this is still the tea market is justly balanced. Say would explain these outcomes by pointing to the natural adjustment process of markets when left free of interference. At first, wheat experienced a glut of 411 bushels because farmers set their stall prices above market clearing levels, which discouraged buyers. At the same time, potatoes showed a want of 245 because farmers priced them too low, encouraging more buyers than sellers. Tea, however, was justly balanced as its price equaled the market clearing price, so supply matched demand. According to Say's law, a product is no sooner created than it, from that instant, affords a market for other products to the full extent of its own value. The act of production generates the purchasing power to buy other goods, and any imbalance in one market is temporary as prices adjust. Wheat farmers reduce their asking price, potato farmers raise theirs, and their resources shift accordingly. Once this process plays out, gluts and wants disappear. Wheat, potatoes, and tea all become justly balanced. For J.B. Say, this demonstrates that production, not government policy, drives demand and that free markets naturally restore equilibrium. Say's law in action, markets with government intervention. Now imagine J.B. Say observing a village market where suppliers facing gluts lobby the government to intervene so they do not have to lower prices to eliminate surplus. Suppliers support such interventions because rising prices increase revenues, while they resist situations where competition drives prices down. In Say's imagined observations of wheat, potatoes, and tea, he carefully recorded transactions as buyers and sellers interacted. He notes a glut of wheat and a want for potatoes. Without government intervention, wheat sellers would need to reduce prices to clear the surplus. By convincing government to purchase the excess using newly issued funds, not backed by additional gold or silver, sellers can maintain their prices. To gain public and official approval, the program would be framed as prudent and beneficial, with the purchased wheat stored to guard against future shortages or poor harvest. The following table transcribes Say's imagined observations before and after government intervention. The red values in Table 2 are the same as those in Table 1. Recall that I have Table 1 here. Notice that the red values are identical to the red values here. But these green values, they're identical to these blue values with the exception of the final prices. The main difference between the two tables appears in the last three columns. In Table 1, the blue values show how markets adjust on their own when the government does not intervene, while the green values in Table 2 illustrate how markets respond when the government takes action to address a perceived problem. Use the green values in Table 2 to complete the answer boxes below. To understand the effects of government intervention, compare these results with the results from the initial conditions you recorded just below Table 1, right there. I've copied Table 2 here. These red values are identical to these red values. These values are identical to these values, but the final prices are different. To make the analysis easier, I've created a wheat market diagram, a potato market diagram, and a tea market diagram. The supply of each product is vertical, perfectly inelastic. Demand is downward sloping, price is on the vertical axis, quantity is on the horizontal axis. Recall that the farmers have set prices above market prices, resulting in a glut of wheat. Potato farmers have set prices below the market price, resulting in a want for potatoes. Apothecaries have set prices equal to the market price. There is neither a glut nor a want for tea in this market. After government promises to buy any glut of wheat that may result, so the government is going to come in here and buy. When the government buys, it is an additional demander of wheat. What happens is the demand curve shifts from black to green, with the difference in the two being the biggest purchaser of wheat in the kingdom being the king. And that temporarily closes the gap here. The glut is gone. However, the king has printed money without additional gold or silver. That creates an inflation. You have a situation where too much money is chasing too few goods. It ends up inflating the demand for wheat, potatoes, and tea. As a result, you get higher prices for wheat. It goes from 10.1 up to 13.1. Potatoes go from a price of 21 to 25.8. The tea price goes from 15.3 to 19.1. So in every situation, the glut is gone. The difference in the quantity of wheat supplied and the quantity of wheat demanded equaling zero suggests that the prices wheat farmers are posting in their stalls at the village market equal the market clearing price. The market clearing price that is now higher due to inflation, resulting in the wheat market clearing, which Say would phrase as the wheat market is justly balanced. The same thing is going on in the potato market. Quantity demanded minus quantity supplied equaling zero suggests the prices farmers are posting in their stalls at the village market equal the market clearing price, again, which is higher now because of the inflation, resulting in the potato market clearing, which Say would say is the potato market is justly balanced. And then finally, the same thing with tea. The quantity of tea supplied and the quantity of tea demanded equaling zero suggests that the prices apothecaries are posting in their stalls at the village market equal the market clearing price, which again is higher due to the inflation that the king created when he printed a bunch of money to buy the glut of wheat. This results in the tea market clearing, which Say would phrase as the tea market is justly balanced. Government interventions can have unintended consequences for prices and overall economic stability. If the king's finance ministers compute the king's price index, KPI, with a simple average of consumer prices, the KPI initially equaled what? These final prices have been elevated by the inflation the king created by printing money without it being backed by gold or silver. We have the KPI, the kingdom's price index, the initial value, and the final value. Now, the finance ministers, as I said, they just do a simple average of prices. So we're going to just take the average of the initial prices and do the same for the final prices. The KPI initially equaled to 2 decimal places, 15.47 in my model. In the absence of government intervention, the KPI would have been 15.3. We would have had a little deflation. Prices came down on average. But it is what? Due to the government intervention. Instead of calculating the final prices with no government intervention, we'll calculate the final price average with government intervention. With government intervention, you get inflation. All the prices went up, resulting in a KPI, a kingdom price index of 19.33. To calculate what the inflation would have been, press Control Z in Excel to restore the KPI. 15.3 minus 15.47, what it is, minus what it was, divided by what it was, times 100. The inflation rate would have been negative 1.08. If the government hadn't intervened, we would have deflation, but it ended up being 1 instead. Instead, it was 25%. Farmers lobbying the king and parliament to purchase the glut of wheat benefited themselves and caused inflation because the program was financed by printing unbacked fiat currency. The influx of money artificially inflates demand without corresponding real increases in production, distorting market adjustments and causing inflation that erodes the purchasing power of commoners and the poor. Say's law of markets is undermined because the stimulus does not come from genuine production, but from monetary expansion, creating artificial market clearing. Say would argue that such policies mislead the public. They appear to help both farmers and the poor, but in reality, they prevent markets from correcting themselves and misdirect scarce resources. When the government purchases surplus wheat with newly printed money, the price of wheat rises above the true market clearing level because wheat supply is inelastic. Farmers cannot produce much more than they already do. The quantity supplied changes very little. At the same time, private demand falls as prices rise, leaving the government to absorb the surplus indefinitely. Rather than disappearing, the glut is simply stored in government warehouses, incurring storage costs and tying up resources. Say would argue that this is not genuine market demand, but artificial demand created by monetary intervention, which prevents the market from naturally clearing. With inelastic supply, farmers cannot easily shift land and labor from wheat into potato production. As a result, the shortage or want of potatoes persists. The market adjusts primarily through higher prices rather than increased output. Potato sellers, aware that buyers are competing for limited quantities, raise their prices until the market clears. However, equilibrium is reached at a higher price level rather than through additional production. Say would emphasize that the shortage could have been corrected more efficiently if resources had been allowed to move naturally from wheat to potatoes, as it did in Table 1, letting the market achieve balance without artificial interference. The tea market was already justly balanced. In real terms, production still matches consumption, so nothing changes fundamentally. However, because the government has injected new paper money into the economy, nominal tea prices rise along with general prices. This illustrates one of Say's core points. Printing money does not create real wealth. Instead, it distorts relative values and redistributes purchasing power. Tea sellers may gain temporarily from higher nominal prices, but tea buyers lose, and society as a whole does not gain any real benefit because the inflation results in higher input prices. The labor costs go up. The tea that they have to import from foreign countries goes up. Modern policy applications. Despite Keynesian critiques in the 1930s that highlighted persistent demand shortfalls, Say's models have experienced a resurgence in supply side economics, which emphasizes production, entrepreneurship, and the incentives to produce rather than short term demand side stimulus. Say's law underpins policies such as tax cuts and deregulation, seen in examples like Reagan's 1980s reforms and the 2017 U.S. Tax Cut and Jobs Act, arguing that expanding productive capacity and entrepreneurial activity generates jobs and stimulate demand naturally. Post 2008 financial crisis and during the COVID-19 pandemic, policymakers have invoked Say's insights to advocate reducing regulatory burdens and focusing on supply constraints, including supply chain bottlenecks, rather than relying solely on fiscal stimulus. Similarly, the entrepreneurial model guides modern policies designed to nurture startups and innovation, including tax incentives, venture capital support, and simplified licensing frameworks, exemplified by the U.S. Jobs Act and the EU Startup Nation Standard. Global institutions like the IMF and World Bank also apply these principles when advising developing nations, promoting entrepreneurship through education, intellectual property protection, and market access. It is important for students to understand that Ricardo, Say, and other classical economists developed these fundamental ideas before the widespread use of formal mathematical equations, graphs, or supply and demand curves. Their reasoning was largely verbal and conceptual, relying on logical arguments about production, rents, and market mechanisms. Both Say's law and the entrepreneurial model continue to inform debates on innovation-driven growth, such as AI regulation, advocating minimal interference to allow entrepreneurial activity to generate demand and counterbalance Keynesian emphasis